So we got another one here. Let's jump into the second one here of the Transformers Slag podcast Patreon listener questions. Once again, if you want to be part of the Transformers Slag Patreon, patreon.com/protoman, or check the pinned comment or the description below. Come join the Patreon. Let us know we're doing a good job and help support the podcast. If you want to know about all the cool stuff, you get a lot of cool stuff. Definitely be sure to check that out. Talked about it in the last segment. Don't want to repeat it too much, but definitely check that out. So let's jump into yet again another Patreon listener question. We got one here from Space Ghostal, one of our Primus tier members here. And Space Ghostal wants to know, hey Proto Man, why does Ultra Magnus have armor? Why doesn't other Autobots have the same thing like him? Are there any Decepticons that have a similar kind of armor? Now, I'm going to probably stick this within the Generation 1 cartoon continuity because that really is where Ultra Magnus's armor made its true debut to the creative consciousness of the world. You know, we can jump into that of, like, let's say the Marvel comic books universe. We can look at some of the other offshoot of continuities like IDW and the craziness that involves the armor of Ultra Magnus and the spoiler nature with that. But I think we'll just stick with Ultra Magnus and the cartoon continuity, and we'll only like pick and pull out stuff from outside really to kind of continue this conversation. Now, the thing is that why does Ultra Magnus have armor? That really stems from the early creative ideas of Fleur O'Deary and when they were designing Ultra Magnus. Ultra Magnus originally was not going to be the character that we know today. He was supposed to be actually the Orion Pax design, and the Orion Pax design was supposed to be Ultra Magnus. You know, Hasbro just kind of was like, hey, you know, we have this powered convoy mold. We could kind of import this over here, which is what would be Ultra Magnus, and we could call this a brand new character. And I still firmly believe, it's never been confirmed, but when I look at the old trailers and stuff, and when I even look at how Diaclone handled the powered commander mecha, if you will, I won't say character because they were piloted mechas in Diaclone, but I've always felt that the intent was it to be an upgraded Optimus Prime. I always felt like, even looking at that early prototype kind of Transformers the movie trailer with the red and blue Ultra Magnus based off of the powered convoy colors, I've always felt that that could have been a natural progression. And why Ultra Magnus was like featured on the cover of the 1986 movie, like predominantly for more than one reason. I feel like in the early inceptions and early thoughts that, and obviously we've had first draft scripts and everything that evolves later on, but I really feel that that armor was supposed to be for Optimus Prime, and that would have been like the next step of it. And then just through the decisions to kind of make this the Ultra Magnus character and not use Fleur O'Deary's design, and that design would go on to be Orion Pax, like I said before, there is this decision that, okay, maybe we'll make it a white Optimus Prime. You know, we won't really acknowledge it being an armor. He just transforms from the truck mode to that of the robot mode, and anyone who owns the toy will know the truth that lies beneath more than meets the eye. And that was it, more or less the early indications of that. Obviously, the first time we really acknowledge it being an armor more than anything else is years and years later with the Dreamwave comic books with Pat Lee, when he really was like, hey, you know, under that Ultra Magnus armor is a white Optimus Prime, and creating all those connections with that. 2001 and 2002 and 2003 really started to tie Optimus Prime and Ultra Magnus as characters. The Dreamwave books really played it up that there was a deep connection there. You know, when we had the RID cartoons, there was a connection there. They were brothers. When you have the early Japanese kind of explanations of the character with Operation Combination, Scramble City, the implication that, you know, Ultra Magnus is like a little brother to Optimus Prime, but they never really dived into it. It all stems from that he's a white Optimus Prime repaint that has an armor, but it was never acknowledged in fiction until we literally got to the Dreamwave comics, which, while not based in the G1 cartoon continuity, was definitely playing within that world at some point, especially in the early beginnings of those comics. Now, why he has the armor, I could make up an answer. He was a second in command kind of city commander character, especially he was fighting the war back on Cybertron while Optimus was still on Earth all those millions of years, especially when he was missing. And I just feel that he probably just needed to have something to buff himself up in a war where energy was definitely diminishing. And he probably was a white Optimus Prime, and then he just needed that armor just to like get a little extra go, a little extra something something. When we really think about it, and I've said this many times, Ultra Magnus in a lot of ways was the first ever super mode. Because when we jump forward in Transformers' history, especially when we look at the Autobot leaders that have super modes, when we look at Power Master Optimus Prime, or more specifically its Japanese version of Ginrai, when we look at even something like, let's say, Fortress Maximus that has his transformed head robot mode, and then it has an individual robot mode, but then combines with his giant fortress to make Fortress Maximus. There's so many different kinds of early indications of that all really start in a lot of ways with Ultra Magnus. Because then when you move forward, you look at Starsaber, and he has his regular small robot, then he combines with his trailer, which becomes an armor for him, and then he becomes Starsaber, the bigger robot. And I could go on. And even if you want to go even more to a traditional armor sense, look at Robots in Disguise 2001, aka Car Robots, looking at Fire Convoy, aka Optimus Prime from that, where that's an even more truer example of an armor that wraps around the character. And I could go on. Armada and the Unicron trilogy and how those guys work with all their armors. But it really starts with Ultra Magnus, because Ultra Magnus was like the first one to have that, where there's the front part of the truck, the trailer, he transforms. It has an individual robot mode, never acknowledged in the cartoon, but then could combine with his trailer to make a super mode. As far as we were concerned, Ultra Magnus was always in super mode. Just it never was established like that. Now the question is, like you said here, did any other Autobots have something like that? Predating Ultra Magnus, and it's more so just a fact because it doesn't have Transformer origins, in 1985 we had Jetfire. Now Jetfire, his traditional actual robot mode, if you looked at his origins with the Macross line, the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, you have the traditional Valkyrie jet without the armor pieces on it, all those red armor pieces, and when it transformed, having all those non-armor pieces on it. Then later on in the show, you had Super Valkyries, which had all those armor pieces, the boosters and everything like that. So technically, and I say technically, Jetfire was the first. Now granted, we didn't have that design in the show. We had Skyfire, and they kind of abandoned all that stuff with the armor and it being removable. And same thing with the comics. It was used only in a couple panels by mistake, if anything, by transition. So not exactly the best example, but technically Jetfire is one of them. And then, of course, if you want to go on a technicality, every single Pretender shell. And that goes into also your third question, which is, are there any Decepticons that had a similar kind of armor? Nothing that had a similar kind of armor, but I can give you some technicalities. Number one, again, the Pretenders. Whether it be organic stuff like the monsters or more mechanical stuff like, let's say, the Transformers Victory evil Pretenders, like the space gangsta Pretenders of Blue Bacchus and Black Shadow. But then even you could look at stuff like the UK Action Masters, where you have Slicer and the UK beautiful pink and green Thundercracker, where they had these vehicles that they rode, and then they would transform into a power armor for them. But then we go, yeah, but now they don't have robot modes because they're Action Masters. So there's a lot of weird technicalities when it comes to that. But Ultra Magnus really is a kind of a unique cat when it comes to it. And because of his complicated origin, and how it was a last-minute kind of change to make him Ultra Magnus, combined with the fact that they never acknowledged that inner robot mode. If anything, I remember as kids, like, we were just going like, hey, that white Ultra Magnus, that's Optimus Prime when he has that, hate plague armor put on him, if anything. Like, that's what we kind of acknowledged it at. Or even a dead Optimus Prime toy. Ultra Magnus was never seen outside of that as far as we were concerned back in the 80s and even the early 90s. It wasn't until Pat Lee that he go like, hey, this thing exists, and then all the merchandise that came afterwards. The second that happened, that issue of Volume 2, I think it was called Art and War, of the Dreamwave books, that all of a sudden Hasbro and Takara was like, yeah, we could repaint Optimus Prime toys white and call it Ultra Magnus, and the rest was history. So as far as I'm concerned, why does he have the armor? He needed it because the war was going crazy while Optimus was gone for 4 million years. So, and he had to pick up the mantle in a lot of ways and fight against Shockwave. And actually, now that we mention even Shockwave, Shockwave technically has an armor too in the Siege line. He has his little, I don't know, battleship carrier, and then he has his individual robot mode, and then he has his armor that goes around it that was kind of forced on, if anything. But that's, again, going outside of the main cartoon G1 and looking at just toys. I'm pretty sure there's many other examples. I'm just going off the top of my head here. Going to the second part of your question, answer quickly, did any other Autobots have it? There's other Autobots that had some kind of armors. You could even argue stuff like, let's say, even Roadbuster and a lot of those non-show characters that had those very unique kind of ideas. You know, even stuff like, Omega Supreme with all those pieces that, you never saw them come off, but you could technically remove armor pieces off of him to make his Omega Supreme mode. And then again, of course, Jetfire. And as opposed to Decepticons, Pretenders, certain characters, the Action Masters, it goes into real, technicalities, if anything else. But that's more or less it. He was a unique individual. And again, to me, Ultra Magnus, the big takeaway was he was the invention of the super mode. It's just that he wasn't the first to acknowledge it. The first true super mode really was, in a lot of ways, it was slightly Fortress Maximus with the Headmasters cartoon, and more so Ginrai with Master Force, where they were first acknowledging, here's an Optimus Prime alt mode, and then it's going to combine with its trailer to make a larger mode. Same thing with Fortress Maximus. Here's this individual head robot mode, and then he pulls out the Master Sword, transforms, and combines with his base mode to make this gigantic Fortress Maximus. So those were the first examples of that, even though Ultra Magnus technically, and everything's about technicalities today, but technically Ultra Magnus was the first. So I hope that answers your question, Space Ghostal. It's an interesting one. I'm curious what other people have to think about it, because it's a very odd piece of Transformers history. Again, it stems more just from the fact that Transformers really was a product of multiple different things in its early iterations and different origins, which then had to be, bashed together to make some kind of coherent fictional narrative. But it's still fascinating when you think about it. And then how, someone like Pat Lee and people who were fans of the brand as a kid, and then looking at those toys and asking those questions, and then wanting to answer those questions in a fictional context and in a narrative context, much like Sakamoto, what he does today with the Legends manga. It's just interesting to see. And let's not even get to Ultra Magnus armors and the Dreamwave, not the IDW books and everything like that, because that's a whole other story for a whole other time. So, hope that answers your question. Again, if you want to be like Space Ghostal and join the Patreon, ask some listener questions, or just join us on the Discord, check us out, patreon.com/protoman. Check the pin description. Check the description, or the pin description, or the pin comment, whatever I want to call it at this point. But I hope that helped you answer your question just a little bit.